So I'm here not to talk about the Salpêtrière Hospital, which is another big hospital for neuroscience, but we already have Sainte-Anne, so that's fine for history. But just to give you an overlook of the French initiative regarding rare disease and how in this initiative psychiatry appears somewhere at the end of the first program in 2007. So today, the French initiative in the field of neuroscience and neurodevelopmental disorder has two large networks. One is Andy-Rare, which is here on the slide. Do we have a... No, maybe with the... avec la souris, ouais. And the other one is DefiScience, the one where we are. Why is it like that? And I think it's important to get this in mind because the Engage network in some way has to deal with that, is that at least in France, where we have a lot of geneticists and a lot of, molecular geneticists and clinician geneticists, at the beginning of their network, they were trying to expel psychiatry. So, and the Andy-Rare is almost only geneticists, whether they are molecular geneticists or pediatricians, clinicians doing genetics and syndromes. The DefiScience network try to gather together people who deal with disease of neurodevelopment, but also with a multidisciplinary approach, which is much more what we find in that DefiScience. And that's why we have 5 national networks, one for rare intellectual disability, malformation of the cerebellum, Prader-Willi syndrome, and I'm sure that a lot of psychiatrists here knows Prader-Willi syndrome because we had a lot of comorbidity with psychiatric comorbidity with this syndrome, rare epileptic syndrome, and psychiatric rare disease, which is our network actually. So in terms of medical disciplines, you have, of course, geneticists in that network, a lot of geneticists, psychiatrists, endocrinologists, and neuropediatricians. This is the main discipline. So in terms of history, as I told you, we started in 2007, the Center for Rare Disease, and for psychiatry. And I have to say it was not a network because we were only located at the Salpêtrière, and it was not even the whole discipline because it was only child psychiatry. And actually, when I applied to receive the funding regarding the Center for Rare Disease, actually the committee, which was almost done only of geneticists, rejected the call. And it's the Ministry of Health that asked me to open, because of our experience in syndromic genetics, and psychiatric comorbidity, asked me to open the center and funded it. But they asked us to do something like, could you please be the maid for all the syndromic genetics that has a behavioral problem? So they asked me to treat challenging behavior associated with genetic syndromic syndrome, and not really to do a specific disease, and that's what I applied for. It was early onset schizophrenia, which is a rare disease actually. So I argue with them that I wanted to keep early onset schizophrenia in the title. So they say, okay, if you want to do it like that, you will do both. And that's the way we started. And when we renewed in 2016, because there was a new plan to see how the first year of funding were doing. Finally, the need for psychiatry in the field of clinical genetic and syndromes was so obvious for all the patient association, the parents association, and also the politicians. So we were able to open it to adult psychiatry first, And that's why there is no more mention about early onset schizophrenia, because we were afraid that adult schizophrenia will leave us from the rare disease. So, and from the funding, because the funding was really dedicated to rare disease. But anyway, so in 2016, we had this new Center for Psychiatric Rare Disease, which now is a kind of network, because we are not alone. So at the beginning, we were here in Paris. So now we have two other big collaborative center, which is Sainte-Anne here for adult psychiatry, let's say in the north of France, and Lyon with Caroline Demy in the south of France. And we have also other teams that have not received funding, but that have facilities and I want to collaborate in that kind of disease. So it's very helpful, and we try in each cities that was aiming to enter the network to always associate adult psychiatry and child adolescent psychiatry. And I think this is very important, because we need to have a lifetime neurodevelopmental approach. So who are the patients referred to the network? I decided in my presentation to be very low grounded in terms of publication on clinical aspects. You will have many talks with fine molecular genetics and very nice research, but I'm a clinician. As a research laboratory, I am in the engineering lab, so I do robotic and big data, which has something to do with genetics now, because when you do GWAS, it's better to know about big data analysis, but it's not what I do as a researcher. But I'm very much involved in clinical genetics and the psychiatric part. So who are the patients that are referred? So it started before 2007, because to be funded, you need to show that you already do something in the field. So mainly we have 5 motivation to get into the network. And I think it's maybe these 5 entrants that will help us to understand where is psychiatric genetic counseling, in my sense at least. So of course, we have early onset schizophrenia, because it was our core. We have challenging behavior associated with rare disease. As I told you, this was our mandate, initial mandate. But we also have rare disease in need for a dimensional diagnosis or a functional diagnosis, because patients and the families, they are asking this to us. And you will have a very nice presentation of the team of Lyon about that. Rare disease with a psychiatric phenotype, because I told a little bit about Prader-Willi syndrome, and you will have Maite Taubert tomorrow. She will give you a very nice talk about Prader-Willi and recent advances in treatment. And of course, you have also psychiatric syndrome with an organic comorbidity. And organic comorbidity, they are not always genetic one, actually. You also have, and you know about the autoimmune encephalopathy. We had the first cases in France in my department. So just to give you very fast some examples. So the first point, rare disease with a psychiatric phenotype. So you know the list. I will not go into detail into the list. You know 20q1 deletion, because it's very common in psychiatry. Prader-Willi syndrome, myotonic dystrophy type 1. I like this example, because this example, we had the opportunity to show that the phenotype is not a continuous variable. And in the field of neuropsychology, usually we say that IQ, it's a normal distribution in the population. But it's not true when you look at myotonic dystrophy type 1, and you have clearly 2 pikes that distinguish the patient. And we don't really know why. We have hypotheses and some correlation why they are distributed like that during neurodevelopment. Of course, you also have the best example of the complexity of genotype and phenotype relationship is tuberous sclerosis, because we have many studies showing that, of course, genes intervene, but also the number of brain tumors that you have in the brain, the tuber localization, and it's obvious that localization on the parietal areas are the worst for the phenotype. And of course, you also have, when you have a West encephalopathy, the prognosis, whatever the other factors, is worst. And again, in tuberous sclerosis, you have clearly two distinguished phenotypes. So early onset schizophrenia, you will have a presentation about genetics and schizophrenia, so I will be very brief on that. The only thing I wanted to show you on that slide, it's what we use in clinical care. So you don't have high standard molecular research genetics on that slide, but only our experience that we had on early onset schizophrenia. So well-documented copy number variation, but also some rare genetic syndrome, and also a few cases of autoimmune disorders. So psychiatric condition, the third entrance with organic comorbidity. You remember the slide that Mario did present about neurodevelopment, and usually we consider that schizophrenia is also a disease of neurodevelopment. But when you go to the DSM, which is the way we classify disease, usually schizophrenia is not on the umbrella of neurodevelopmental disorder. So I'm talking about DSM, neurodevelopmental disorder. So you have intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, and you're going to hear Thomas Bourgeron about the genetic of autism, epileptic encephalopathy, Tourette syndrome, ADHD, and learning disability. What I have tried to distinguish the first three, because the genetic load is not the same regarding the neurodevelopmental disorder. And when you have, because in the clinical practice, what you need to is to explain if you have a major genetic impact, and usually it's rare mutation or abnormalities that have a stronger impact compared to common variation that have a very low impact. And usually when you have common variation with very low impact, it's more a multi-gene approach that you have. And it's very difficult to have multi-gene approach in clinical practice. But on intellectual disability, on autism, on epileptic encephalopathy, you have a certain percentage. It's not, it's usually about 30% where you can find major genetic abnormality. And when you go to other disorders, and I put schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder in the same way because it's probably in adult psychiatry and in early onset schizophrenia, you have an even bigger genetic load in this kind of disease that you find major genetic causes. So, but apart from our DSM definition in disease, we also have genetic syndrome, clinical syndrome in psychiatry that might give us another view. So I like to talk about pediatric catatonia because it's my field of clinical expertise. And in the field of pediatric catatonic syndrome, we have shown repeatedly the number of organic disease that we find, at least in young patients. And so this is a paper, these are two papers with updates, so if you want to refer it, but we also defined some kind of clinical characterization and classification of catatonic syndrome. And as you see in pediatric catatonic syndrome, we went up to 20% of organic cause, which is very high for child psychiatry. And it's not only genetic causes, it's also autoimmune and inflammatory disease. And I was very happy that very recently in the Lancet Neurology, a large conference consensus of neurologists ended to define probable autoimmune encephalitis, because for many years with internal medicine, because I collaborate more with internal medicine than with neurologists, because they were on autoimmune disease for many years compared to neurologists, and we had already defined this kind of patient that we treat very actively even when they are autoimmune negative. So just an update about the genetic condition we had in catatonic syndrome, and it's work done with Claudine in my team. And again, we had 50 patients that have, which is 50% of the cohort, with a likely contribution from a genetic condition. So you have the list. I won't go into detail. And just recently, we don't have, and this is to be explored, and we are looking for a lab to help us to see if the cell culture might be interested on that topic. But we have a family with a compound heterogeneous transmission of missense variant of CTTNBP2, sorry, gene in this family, and the two brothers, they have mild intellectual disability and early onset schizophrenia with catatonic feature. And we just have the second brother hospitalized for the catatonic syndrome. And so we believe it's very likely that there is something with that gene, but as you know, when you have, because this was from exome, that was not just clinical, let's say, facilities that we have with the genetic team. So we need to do some work to have the causal relationship between for this genotype and the phenotype. So the four, we have five, so I'm almost finished. Rare disease in need for dimensional diagnosis. So when we published this paper in very small journal about autism, I did not know that the DSM-5 was willing to introduce some dimension in the definition of autism, which was very new compared to DSM-4. The problem is that in DSM-5, they were very limited in the way they define dimension in autism. They introduced catatonia, and I was glad because I'm a specialist of catatonia, but catatonia is very rare in autism, so it's not really clinically relevant for most child psychiatry or neurologist that sees autism patient. But when you look at autism and the different dimensions, you have, of course, repeated interest, and social interaction, which are the two core dimensions now. But you also have problems in emotional regulation, in anxiety, in attention and executive function, in motricity, in hyperactivity, in communication and language. So what you define as the syndrome is just a piece of it. And when you treat patients with autism, and in general with neurodevelopmental disorder, you need to understand these different dimensions because you need to tailor the intervention on the potentiality of the child, but also his difficulties. So this kind of approach, we had the opportunity to apply it in a large database at the Salpêtrière Hospital, actually, on Tourette syndrome. And I was very pleased that using big data analysis, we were able to define 3 clusters of patients. The first one was, let's say, the classical, Tourette syndrome, which is this one. The second one was a cluster of neurodevelopmental patients because they had a lot of comorbidities here. You see ADHD, communication disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and whatever. And a very novel cluster one that has never been shown in Tourette syndrome, which is a cluster with, of course, Tourette, but also dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and it's not on the slide. They had a higher intellectual quotient compared to the 2 other clusters. So it was really interesting. So finally, we also treat, and this is quite, at least in my department, a specialty, challenging behavior associated with rare disease. And that was the mandate we had in 2007. And so in 2010, we opened the first neurobehavioral unit in France to receive these very, very, very severe cases. I can tell you it's the worst you can see in psychiatry. And we are in a very small worldwide network with the Kennedy Krieger Hospital in Baltimore, which has also a neurobehavioral unit. And maybe in Switzerland, there will be in Lausanne a unit like that, because they just hire Vincent Guinchat, my collaborator that opened the unit, and they are talking about one in Belgium and also in Canada. So just to give you an example of this case, and you don't care what is the genetic deletion that explained at least for that kind of because we use a multidisciplinary approach. Here you have this kid, and I don't show you videos because the videos are really terrible. Not the quality, but what you see for this child. But you can understand, this is at the beginning of the inpatient stay, and this is when he finished. So it's 6 months of inpatient stay. And you have a patient with autism, intellectual disability. He had so many self-injurious behavior that he became blind. When he became blind at 4 years, the mother stopped working, stay with him at home. So the whole system was really crazy. Of course, nobody wanted to give them solution because it's very complex, and the more it is complex, the more it's difficult to find a solution, and it's everywhere in the world. Because there are a lot of critics about the French system, but I will remind that the French system is free, which is not always like that everywhere. And when I go in conferences with that kind of cases, I'm always surprised that in all over the world, they told me, we have the same cases, but nobody published on it, and nobody talks about them. So what we did is a multidisciplinary approach with sensory motor, because we need to define with him new ways of communicating, because when he became blind, he had some kind of panic, you know, of his blindness, and he did not know how, with this very limited intellectual skill, how to communicate further. And the mother did not know either. So we had to treat also some organic disease that he has as comorbidity. We use medication that are, you know, very empirically decided, and it's not really evidence-based in these kind of cases. We also use therapeutic body wrap, which is a very controversial treatment, and I have many, many problems even with justice everywhere with that. But I'm still proud using that kind of treatment, and if you are interested, I will show you videos if you want. At the end of this multidisciplinary approach, he was able to go back at home. And of course, we had behavioral treatment and behavioral training of the parent at home to help them deal with the child and with the new acquisition he had in terms of communication, although he was blind. So we have many challenges in our workshop. Francisca already talked about the program, so I will not comment on it. And I think we can go on the genetic of autism.